Chapter 3. The variegated Chandler's shop front, which he saw after his arrest, becomes St. Basil's Church with its many-colored onion-shaped domes at one end of Red Square. And as if the antiquarian's crosses and censers, his whole display of stoles and dalmatics, were rising from the earth, the cupolas of a convent fortress, glittering with copper stars, rise in the night, with their double crosses and their rigging of golden chains covered with rooks and pigeons. Below, a counter-revolutionary city cluttered with votive offerings, toys and sanctuaries. Old Russia, whose blood-stained mysticism fails to conceal the corpses of the revolutionaries. The foreign battalion sent to reinforce the troops that had been beaten back takes cover in a wood with a machine gun. In the fortress there are cells. In one of the cells, a prisoner. He will make his escape. He is in a corridor, behind a grimy window, of flowers barely visible, 2 spots, one red, one green, in color. In color! He is running towards an airplane. His wife is in Prague. Kastner's mind was turning round and round in the obsession of escape, like his body in the cell. He must remember minutely, doggedly reconstruct, not be carried away, recreate. He demanded too much of fate to love his past, but his disintegrated memory had recovered its strength by finding an objective. Patiently, stubbornly, he worked back to that wood full of anxious suspense before the town huddled in the rift of fog. The night presses against the wintry earth, weighed down by a presence that slowly takes possession of the entire nocturnal landscape. Orthodox crosses brandished like cudgels, Russian processional banners with their paste pearls catching reflections of moonlight gradually loom up over a knoll. A boar scurrying through the foliage. It is insurgent on the run, his mouth wide open, a blue fleck of moonlight on his eyes. A pope in high ceremonial vestment appears on the hummock, clinging with all his weight to the banner pole which he has used to hoist himself. The material flutters and ripples in the breeze that has just risen. Kastner listens for the accompanying sound. Nothing. Complete silence. And no rustle of leaves, none of the earth's nocturnal whispers. No sound accompanied the boar-like flight of the man beside him a moment ago. And that open mouth is shouting, and he does not hear it. Deaf, he heard his own scream ringing through his brain, and the sound of the wicket which the guard had just opened. The latter looked at the prisoner, who was stunned by the light, panting in his anguish as though he were choking, shrugged his shoulders, and the deafening clatter of the wicket buried Kastner once more in his controlled madness. The popes who have come up over the knoll begin to advance with their dalmatics and tiaras under the crosses and banners, and a boundless unreality animates this marching treasure, this goldsmith's folly let loose over the muddy fields, with all those white beards and those trembling gleams of pearls and silver in the moonlight. They approach, and in voices of whipped-up hatred they chant the psalm which has been lurking for hours in the cell, and which passes into the rustling leaves like an escaping animal and mingles with the remote tinkle of their silver trappings. The distant howling of a dog, close as the shadow of a bird gliding with outspread wings. No, it is a prisoner howling in a neighboring cell. Mustering all his strength, Kastner fixes his eyes on a small creature, a rat or a ferret, that scurries off, heading towards the popes. They are now motionless, dwarfed by the vast lunar landscape, although their crosses look like bludgeons. They are unarmed, and it is difficult to fire on an unarmed man unless he is hiding. They are handling some small objects from which rises smoke that soon turns to dust, seeming to solidify in the wind under the moon. Sensors. How long is it since Kastner has smoked? The night wafts towards him an odor of churches, incongruous in this outspread landscape glazed by cold and hatred under the radiance of the great starry sky. While this dank smell settles little by little over the pungent boxwood leaves, more figures appear over the knoll, row upon row, bristling with menacing crosses. Behind them, the whites who yesterday, thanks to them, recaptured the village. The screams of a red peasant undergoing torture in the bleak sunshine of a wintry afternoon have lasted more than an hour. It is the prisoner in the neighboring cell who is screaming again. There are many forms of torture in the imagination of men. Kastner clamps his hands over his ears. There is a shot from behind the crosses. One of the whites fires. Almost immediately another shot fired by one of the popes, a revolver. A third one gives off the same red light as the censers, and the machine gun of the foreign battalion begins to fire. It is a little behind Kastner. He prudently draws back. It is tapping small, even blows, like a key on the bars of a cell grill. The end of a branch shot off by a bullet falls, swept sideways by the wind. Kastner has fed this very same machine gun in the Caucasus. He remembers the time when he had to cool it by crushing grapes over its red-hot barrel. The sizzling sound of the juice as it bubbled over the steel. A pope, the third one tonight, falls clutching several times at his cross as though he were turning round it. The others begin to run, mingling now with the white soldiers who are catching up with them. The tempo of the machine gun fire becomes more rapid, and shots from the old guns flash on all sides through the woods. The insurgents have seen the whites at last, and all these deaths seem a mockery in the indifference and the great silence of the stars. "Where are you from?" the machine gunner asks Kastner. "Foreign communist." Once more silence in the wind and the night. "I'm from the Altai. Look at them lying there, with their silver robes and their great white beards. Why are they like the snow that lingers in the mountain clefts? On the night-darkened earth, the fallen bodies form the design of a great white vulture with torn wings and an enormous beak. A voice in the cell articulated clearly, but in a mere whisper, the solemn words, "They are dead," and a little louder, "Anna is also dead, I tell you, she is dead." Beneath Kastner's hands, still clamped to his ears, the blood was panting, summoning images as a diver clamors for air. Blood, his only living companion, full of submerged bells ringing, conscious of the earth's suffering, of rhythmic gallops in the dead of night. The walls of the cell had just come closer to Kastner. No, it was the tide of anguish, rising at each peal of the bells in his temples. Back to the town, back to the town. Is it the same convent, or is it not? Its bells lost in the sky, it drifts with the dreary clouds like a phantom ship, far from its dead crews stretched out in full regalia on the frozen plains. Why watch with such fascinated attention the arm of a bearded man in a brocaded doublet who tries to catch two falling snowflakes in his glass full of vodka at the foot of the wall over whose edge the hanged insurgents are still dangling from the great black bells covered with fluttering rooks? He is there in the midst of the great concentrated silence, in which hundreds of pieces of gilt furniture transform the main street into a chaotic drawing room made snug by the low sky, which is now turning yellow, Having captured the town at daybreak in a great whirling movement of men and frosted leaves through the last shreds of night, the insurgents have dragged from the rich houses all the twisted furniture, a fantastic assortment of Baroque Russian adaptations of Louis XV and escargot. On the largest piano, with feet like cathedral gargoyles, there is an enormous spray of artificial white flowers. In the midst of all this, a carnival of the bearded insurgents is in full swing. They have stripped the popes of their chasables, and in the intervening few hours have tailored the brocade into tales of Hoffman costumes. They make their way between the gilt and silvered armchairs and pianos in the dim light in which snow now begins to fall, like lunatics who have suddenly taken over an opera house. From the ground rises a distant, disquieting rumble choked by the snow. Resisting the onrush of images, Kastner concentrated on the approaching sound of this muffled pounding, its hurried beat gradually slowing down to the rhythm of a steamboat engine. Abandoning their armchairs and their dreams, the insurgents scurried into the houses. A few shots and nothing more. There was no fighting. Nothing but the rhythm of blood pounding in his temples, which was now shaking the bowels of the earth, all the more distinct as it was being pierced through by furious whinnyings. The cavalry! Here they come round the corner, harnessed, saddled with all their semi-Asiatic trappings. Thousands of riderless horses were invading the town. With the long wave-like gallop of creatures turned wild, they wheeled into the main street, carried away by their own momentum like sails before the wind, knocking over settees and armchairs in a pandemonium of hoofbeats and whinnyings. They were rushing, hurtling forward with necks stretched out in front of their foam-covered backs, crowded by the street like cattle by the entrance to a corral, as if sprung fully harnessed from prehistoric migrations. The tiny figures of the last insurgents were fleeting before this convulsed fleet, whose motion rose and fell. Both fleet and sea filled the street from end to end, before the dull eyes of the mangy nags stamping frantically behind their wooden fences. The fleeing Cossacks had abandoned their mounts. Covetously, the insurgents watched this squandered wealth which was rushing past them in an inexhaustible stream, until finally, behind the Cossack horses, the peasant horses appeared. They had torn down their fences in the stampede. After all those trappings, these saddleless horses looked naked, with an altogether human nakedness. The tight clusters of sound made by their hooves in their wild flight towards the gathering dusk opened gradually like fans towards the woods already half enveloped in darkness. In spite of the gloom and the war crouching behind the mountains, they were the very cry of the quivering earth, joyful beneath the frost. The open air, a coldness unlike that of prison walls, reared like one of those horses, the last of which were disappearing, with heads tossed back, rearing in the icy night, hammering the naked earth with its savage hooves, the earth that was as living as the rivers and the sea. Kastner opened his eyes. There was nothing with a cutting edge, neither a rope nor a handkerchief. Open his veins with his fingernails? He found that they were not yet long enough. Was there nothing else? A friend of his had asked that one of his veins be opened after his death, to be sure that circulation had ceased. Kastner remembered the assistant's scalpel. The doctor had refused, seeking the fine white vein in flesh that no longer bled. Thus, with his bloody fingertips, he would seek one of his own full and throbbing veins without seeing it. His body, which had appeared to him so vulnerable, now lived with a dully invincible animation. His heart and respiration protected by its cage of bones. Quote, nature acts as though men were always anxious to commit suicide, end of quote. He felt a need both to die in peace and to sink his thumbs into the throat of the first guard who entered, without letting go, no matter what happened. How could he make his death useful in this hole? It was impossible to help anyone. Quote, to have had so many opportunities to die, end of quote. How badly fate chose. He would have to fall back on his fingernails. It would not be so very simple. He went up to the streak of light that outlined the door and was able to make out his hand with its outspread fingers, its nails which felt very short. He would use the nail of his little finger like a vaccination needle. He tried to make it penetrate his flesh at the wrist. In vain. It was too short, but also too round, too blunt. The flesh was both more elastic and harder than he thought. He would have to sharpen the nail by rubbing it against the wall. At least 2 more days. He was still trying to see his fingers, whose tips barely emerged from the total darkness as though they had belonged to a strange hand. His courage had assumed the form of death, and he looked with fascination at that almost invisible flesh which was his and on which the nail which would enable him to kill himself was slowly to grow. Once more he began to pace the floor. The hand which was to be his death hung beside him like a satchel. The hour that was approaching would be the same as this. The 1,000 smothered sounds that teem like lice beneath the silence of the prison would repeat to infinity the pattern of their crushed life, and suffering, like dust, would cover the immutable domain of nothingness. He leaned back against the wall and surrendered himself to stagnant hours.